I really would like you both to talk about, again, we did a lot of handling on marks here. And what influence do you think handling on a mark has in teaching the dog how to mark? And what place does not handling when they're wrong? In other words, letting them work it out. How do you balance those out, and what part do you think each of those factors plays in teaching a dog or helping a dog marking get better?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think it's part of the thing about the terrain here, because we set up so many key marks that really required the dog to fight the factor to do it, and to allow him to go behind the gun sort of would undo the training. If you think about the mark the first day, we had a side hill that's sort of like that, and our line is here, and this bird is thrown, like we both use the term, against the grain, and they going like this, and it was retired, but they're falling out over there. If I'm going to set that mark up, then I'm going to train them to go straight on it. I would say most of my handling is to train them to go straight through significant factors. And it's the test design, day in and day out, that makes it possible for the dog to understand that handling. So I'll set up tests just as often. I spoke yesterday about having just a plain field, just sort of an ordinary with a little elevation so you can run. I'll set up enough tests that don't have, some super strong factor, where if they go behind the gun, they go behind the gun. What I will do is what I call neutralize the factor. So let's say there's a strong crosswind in a field blowing that way. I am not going to just, and I've got my line, let's say this is a longer bird. I'm not just going to throw downwind so they can just fade with the wind and get the bird. That's just letting them run with the factor. I'm going to move my line over here, the wind is blowing that way, and I'm going to run straight downwind, and then if something randomly causes them to go behind the gun or to get lost, I'm going to let them hunt forever. I'm not going to interrupt their line. There's nothing that they're getting away with by going behind the gun. So you have to have a balance in really significant birds that you're handling on and routine birds that you anticipate there will be no handling on. And if you're finding that you're handling too much even on the significant birds, well, then they're either singles or unretired. For each dog, you pick out the appropriate challenge. If you want to succeed and it's Buzz, did we leave that? What did we do with Buzz there? Did we leave the gun out? I think we left the gun out there because I know she doesn't have a lot of experience with terrain, and she was successful on that mark, as I recall. So with the notes, I can say, okay, this dog has not done really well on our last 4 or 5 setups. Now let's increase the challenge. But I don't want to handle day in and day out. I mean, I agree that we handled more. I noticed we had a lot of handling from very difficult positions, and I will try to avoid that when I'm doing marking training. So if they get 75 yards over there on the short retired gun, I'm probably going to help, because if you end up with whistle refusals and cast refusals and multiple burns because they wouldn't handle from way out on this against a grain bird, a couple dogs got way up here in the field, and we had to give them come-ins, and then they were coming in this way. And you can rationalize it and say, well, it's an opportunity to train. It's what came up. We need to demand control. I don't want to work on my side hill blind and control at the same time. I just don't want to do it. So I'll figure out another way to work on control. If they get lost out of the picture, we're no longer working on the line. I don't use gun help for teaching them to go straight. But when they get lost in the area and get up here, I'm going to be more inclined to help than I am to handle, because I don't want a handling battle. So I hope maybe that addresses some of what you asked.
Yeah, well, let me compound it by saying, all right, now let's say the factor is not the terrain, but the factor is the tightness of the test, or
sure,
the configuration of the guns.
Right.
What is your attitude about handling in that, where in other words, like if you have a tight converging or you have a hip pocket and the dog wants to kind of avoid the tightness of the test, and would you allow them to go behind the gun and
no,
even if they are routinely successful doing that?
No, in tight marks, I would not, if I set up, pinched birds, and I mean, I guess it's obvious, but I'll still draw it. If you have really, really snug like that. So you're going like that, and let's say really hard is when that's the go bird and this is the memory, in a double configuration. And they come in, they always want to pull out that way. And I think dogs want to do that. I think some people think it's because they've had pressure for going back to an old fall, and so they don't want to sort of risk going back to an old fall. I think they do it more to sort things out in their head. We look at everything out in the field as 2 dimensions, right? There's a line, there's a gun, but they're out there in that 3-dimensional world. And it's very hard. And when you walk out, when you're setting up a test, because sometimes I've set up a test, say, oh yeah, that's really clear. And you go out there and you go, holy cow, is that tight? The 3-dimensional world out there is much tighter than it appears in 2 dimensions from the line. So I don't think they go out here necessarily as a cop-out to begin with. I think they just can't sort it out. And I also think that's why dogs run at the guns. That's a big reason they run at the guns, because it's a lot easier to do that and that than it is to really go in there straight on. In terms of keeping track of where you are out in the field, that's an easier way to do it. So if I set this up and it's an appropriate challenge, I will make them go inside. Now, what would that involve? Not necessarily pressure. It might be a call back and a move up a little. It might be rethrowing the bird if they were really lost. This happens a lot on poison birds. If you throw a poison bird like this and then run a tight blind to it, you have a couple of corrections. They really want to go over here when you try to pick it up. I don't let them do that. I make them go in there. Usually not with pressure, but I'll handle or do something to get them on the correct side. And if I don't want to deal with it, then I don't want to set up a tight mark. I don't want to let them become successful doing that. Do
you have a program where you teach
Yes.
tightness of marks,
Yes.
like the ABC drill?
We do an we don't do it often enough, but we do them.